Welcome to Mafiocracy Now, here on Best Evidence. I'm John Titus, and today in this episode I'm going to update you on the Freedom of Information Act request that I have submitted to the Federal Reserve and that I discussed toward the end of my last video. The last video is called Has the Federal Reserve Been Keeping Two Sets of Books for the Last 50 Years? And basically, since I put that video out on April 12th, the Fed has gotten back to me with a notice saying basically, we are going to provide a response to your FOIA request by May 14th. That notice the Fed sent, though, it does include some other information that I feel is worth passing along, and I'm going to do that here, starting with the request itself and who's handling the request and my own follow-up to the Fed's notice, which I'll get into in a bit. First, though, I want to address something that I've seen in the comments enough to where I need to address it, and that's the very realistic issue of what happens if YouTube deletes this channel. I'm under no illusions that this channel could get deleted by YouTube, because any number of other channels have gotten deleted for saying the wrong things, not to Google's liking, certainly not to the liking of the Federal Reserve. So I need to tell you there's a backup channel to this channel. It's not on YouTube. I've got two backup channels. One is on BitChute and the other is on Odyssey. And you can find links to those backups in items 7 and 8 in the description box below. So, in the event, keep in mind, if the channel does get deleted, you're not going to be able to get back to that description box. So copy and paste those links somewhere safe if you are so inclined and if you want to see this channel continue after YouTube pulls the curtain on me. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but you never know. Anyway, back to the pending FOIA request. In the last episode, I talked about the existence of Federal Reserve memos that discuss certain forms of money, that should the Fed issue certain forms of money, that would lead to the consolidation of the Federal Reserve's books with the federal government books. And that's a major change, and I want to address a couple questions up front before we dive into all this and see the FOIA request and all the rest. The first question is a threshold question, and that's, what? So what? Why is consolidation a big deal? Who cares? The short answer is that the Federal Reserve entity that is issuing money in the U.S. is a private entity. It's really 12 private entities. But it's a private entity and its books are private. The government issuing form, the government body that issues money in the U.S. is the Treasury, and that's a public entity. So consolidation would open the Federal Reserve's books to public inspection. And lest ye doubt the private nature of the Fed's issuing bodies, the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, I would urge you to take a look at the video I made previously called the Federal Reserve Kicking People When They're Down. Go to the 440 mark, and there you will see that the Federal Reserve balance sheet is actually a composite balance sheet. It is the sum of 12 balance sheets from each of the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Bank of Richmond, Chicago, San Francisco, Atlanta, and all the rest. And so that explains the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks being private. That the Fed is very fond of reporting aggregate data that is bereft of the kind of granular detail that you would be able to see the cronyism and the favoritism at work, on a day-to-day basis in the Fed. Consolidation would rip the mask off of that opacity, would rip the mask off the Fed's secrecy, and there, open to public inspection, you would see the U.S. constitutional money power being used, the public money power being used for private gain and private advantage, and that's really, in a nutshell, what the Fed is. And I'm going to touch on that part of the Fed a little bit later in this video. The next question, though, is, well, what kinds of money could the Fed issue that would lead to consolidation? And the answer to that, I'll just tell you right now, is Federal Reserve bills. Not Federal Reserve notes, which is just cash, and not Treasury bills, not T-bills, which is really just bonds. It's IOUs from the government. It's Federal Reserve bills. It sounds like sort of a hybrid. And I'll freely confess, I don't really know what that is beyond what I've read in the transcripts, and I'll get to that in a bit. But it's not just Federal Reserve bills, it's Federal Reserve bills that are backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. Now, how do I know all this? Well, as I discussed previously in the previous episode, I was reading Federal Reserve Open Market Committee transcripts, and if you look in the description box at item 1, you'll see the transcript that I'm talking about. It's from June of 2009. But the problem from that transcript is, insofar as the Federal Reserve bills is concerned, and insofar as consolidation is concerned, The discussion was very high level and it was very brief. And I can't tell you more about those issues, Federal Reserve bills and consolidation, than I've already told you without more information. I happen to know that that information exists because during that discussion, one of the participants in the meeting cited to Fed memos, plural, Federal Reserve staff memos, to back up this assertion that the Fed books would be consolidated with the federal government if the Federal Reserve were to issue bills backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government, and that issuance would result in consolidation. And so it's the transcript. It's a very brief discussion in the transcript, which you can see, and I'll get to that in a minute. It's part of my Freedom of Information Act request. And in that discussion cites to these memos. That's how I know these memos exist, and that's really what I've gone after in the FOIA request and the FOIA request. The problem is that the Fed's never released those memos. It's never released those staff memos. And if you go to item 2 in the description box, I've got a link there to all of the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee materials that were issued in 2009. So you'll see 8 FOMC transcripts because the FOMC, the Open Market Committee, meets 8 times a year. And together with each of those transcripts, you'll see a bunch of other stuff, an agenda, a beige book, a blue book, a green book, all these graphs and charts, and a bunch of memos. And I've poked through those, but there is zero mention in any of those memos of Fed bills, at least in connection with either full faith and credit of the U.S. government or consolidation. So while, in other words, if you go to item 2 in the description box and you start poking through those materials, you'll see a reference to Fed bills, but you won't see any reference to Fed bills talking about the consolidation of the Fed's books or about full faith and credit. And that is why I know that those memos have not been produced. And that is why, as I revealed the last time in the last episode, I submitted a FOIA request to the Fed. And not only that, I made a personal appeal to the Fed chairman to go please expedite my request for these memos. So let me roll you that clip. 2 weeks ago, I submitted a Freedom of Information Act request, and as of yet, the Fed has not responded. That will come in due course, I hope. So I'm really looking forward to reviewing those memos. Mr. Powell, if I could, if you could call over to Mr. Williams in New York and have him expedite those memos to my attention, I would greatly appreciate it, as would my viewers, I feel certain. Okay, that was on April 12th. And I am now pleased to report that the Fed got back to me 1 week later on April 19th. And while the response on April 19th fell short of what I asked for, it was just a notice, as I said, it does nevertheless provide some useful information that I want to pass along in this update. So I've got the Fed's notice to me on April 19th right here on my computer. And from that response, you can see a couple of things, starting with exactly what I asked for. I've got my address here blurred out, but other than that, the response and the Fed's letter to me, the notice, is exactly as it appeared. It came via email. So let's just zoom in and get into it and see what we got here. Okay, upper right, you can see the date that the Fed got back to me. That is April 19th. So exactly 1 week after the last video. In my own request, I submitted to the Fed. I submitted that on March 22nd, 2021, which you can see there in the first paragraph. You can see that there's a footnote there, and I'll get to that in a minute. That relates to the FOIA Service Center of the FOMC, which is actually not where I submitted my FOIA request. I submitted my FOIA request to the Board of Governors, but I'll get to that in a minute. But let's go on to what I requested. What I requested is then set forth in the block quote you see there, and what I asked for was all staff memos referred to as follows. So I'm after a very specific set of staff memos that are referenced very specifically in a meeting of the Federal Open Market Committee, and not just, as I said, the FOMC meets 8 times a year. I am specifically interested in the meeting on June 23rd and 24th, 2009. And even then, I'm not interested in all staff memos referred to in that date, in that meeting. I'm interested in the ones that are discussed by Jeff Lacker on page 97 of the transcript. But before I get into what I'm after in Lacker's quote, I want to say a couple of things about the FOMC and about Lacker. Okay, first the FOMC and then LACR. The FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, is the policy setting committee or policy setting group of the Federal Reserve. Its membership is drawn from the Board of Governors, which is the public body of the Fed, and the private Federal Reserve banks, the 12 regional banks. They're the sort of private part of the Federal Reserve. The FOMC is a blend. Its membership is drawn from both of those groups. The FOMC was created in 1935. The groups from which it's drawn, the Board of Governors was set up in 1913, and the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks was created. They were all created in 1913 with the Federal Reserve Act. The FOMC is sort of the new guy on the block. It's been around since 1935. But like I say, it's the policy setting committee of the Federal Reserve. It meets 8 times a year, as I said, but its transcripts are not available for 5 years. There's a 5-year delay before you get those transcripts. The minutes are released right away, but the minutes don't really tell you anything. Everybody, the minutes are sort of tradable events, but they don't really tell you what was going on in the FOMC meetings. The Fed officials themselves have admitted that really the minutes, they're released contemporaneously, but really they're just a tool to massage and manage, public expectations and public perceptions, and it's really nothing but a propaganda tool. What you want to look at with the Federal Reserve is the Open Market Committee transcripts, but they're on a 5-year delay, so not many people read those things, unfortunately. Now let's talk about Jeff LACR. LACR, at the time of 2009, at the time of this meeting that I'm interested in, LACR was the president of the Richmond Federal Reserve, which back then was the second biggest Federal Reserve bank in the system behind New York. Today it's third, it's behind San Francisco. It may drop to even fifth behind Chicago and Atlanta, but back then it was big. It includes DC. More importantly though, LACR resigned in 2017, interestingly enough, 6 months before he was set to retire. And there was a bit of controversy about LACR's resignation. The official story was that he was involved in a leak of Federal Reserve information in October of 2012 to a group called Medley Global Advisors, which it sounds like an investment group, but it's really like market intelligence. And in fact, Medley had been bought in 2010 by the Financial Times, which is sort of an interesting component to know about, that it's a media organization that LACR's sort of accused of making a leak to. The official story, you can look at the official story in item 3 in the description box below. I've got a link to the Wall Street Journal story that came out at the time. The official story is ridiculous. In fact, even if you took the allegation from the Fed and from the Journal at face value, LACR was guilty of, maybe he gave the perception of confirming, of confirming confidential Federal Reserve information. It's a very mealy-mouthed allegation. But really what you want to do is you look at the timeline of the Journal story, look at September 28th, look at October 2nd, and look at March of 2013. And you can see right there's nothing to the story. The entire leak had already happened by September 28th. That's when the Journal story came out. That's when all the confidential information from whatever Fed meeting they're talking about spilled out. And LACR just comes along, a few days later, 4 or 5 days later, and gives the appearance of confirming to Medley, i.e., the Financial Times, that the confidential information in the Journal story was true. The information was already out. The horse had already been released from the barn. Does the Fed ever track down who the original leakers were? Of course not. The reason the Fed is interested in this story at all, interested in a leak, is that the Southern District of New York, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan, the Southern District of New York, the Federal District Court there, the Attorney's Office was investigating the Fed itself, and basically the Fed needed a fall guy, and so they found Jeff LACR. The Fed does not care about leaks. Leaks happen all the time, and if you doubt me about that, take a look at items 4 and 5 in the description box. There you have a real leak. The Fed gets caught red-handed leaking information itself, and it's never investigated, it's never prosecuted, never chased down. Fed doesn't care about that. What happened in that story in 4 and 5, those items down there, if you read them, is the Fed comes out with, let's say, a jobs report at 2 p.m. Eastern time, and it's coming out of D.C. It's coming out of the Federal Reserve, the Board of Governors in D.C., and it's tradable information. And it's released at 2 p.m. Eastern on the dot. Problem is that what happens is that that information gets traded on within 1 millisecond, all the way in Chicago, in Aurora, where the where the exchanges are, the electronic exchanges for futures trading goes on. The information is traded on instantaneously, which is really physically impossible because it takes 7 or 9 milliseconds or whatever it is for packets of information to travel from DC to Aurora to Chicago to be traded on. But it was traded on in the first millisecond. How was that possible? Well, it's possible because the information, the jobs report or whatever it was, so whatever tradable information, maybe it was an interest rate announcement, doesn't really matter. It was already loaded onto the trading center servers in advance. And the best part of the story is that information was put there in advance, not by the Fed itself, but by one or more news organizations. So read that story. Then you can see the Fed really leaking information. And again, they don't really care about the leakers. They never chase it down. They don't care. They didn't investigate that at all because that was just pursued by one guy. That story was broken by a single guy or a small company. Company's called Nanex. It's in the North Shore of Chicago. The guy who runs it's Eric Scott Hunsader. The guy's a legend in high frequency trading and really forensic analysis of electronic trading. He busts the Fed flat out. Fed gets caught red-handed planning information on servers to be traded. Did Lacker do that? No, Lacker didn't do that at all. Lacker's accused of maybe giving the impression of confirming previously released confidential information from the Fed. So that even under the Fed's own complaint about Lacker, it's not that he's trading on the inside for information, it's that Lacker tells the truth or confirms the truth. So, by way of that background, let's now look at the nuclear warhead of truth that Lacker drops during an FOMC meeting. Let's look at it right here. This is what I'm after. This is the quote I am interested in all of this by Lacker. Quote, "I was stunned to learn in these staff memos that if this had full faith and credit, our books would be consolidated with the U.S. government." This, of course, means Federal Reserve bills. As I said, it's not Federal Reserve notes. It's not Treasury bills. This is Federal Reserve bills. You can actually see that if you pull up the transcript that I've cited in item 1 in the description box. Check that quote out yourself. Just search on the word stunned. You'll find it right away and verify that quote and see that he's talking about Federal Reserve bills. In any event, let's go on and look at how the Fed is processing my request. They tell me staff members are processing your request and they are going to get back to me on or before May 14th, 2021. Now, that is a Friday. Okay, so that's really it. May 14th, 2021. The Federal Reserve is going to get back to me and either it's going to cough up these staff memos that Lacker is talking about here, or it's going to tell me to pound sand. It'll say that very nicely by citing an exemption to the Freedom of Information Act. There's any number of exemptions, but you can place your bets. Personally, I think the Fed is going to cite an exemption, probably exemption number 5, although off the top of my head, I don't remember what that is. But who knows? Maybe the Fed surprises me. They've surprised me in a couple other places. What is certain, though, is this. There's a Loch Ness monster lurking here under Federal Reserve bills, and you see that in that Lacker quote talking about consolidation. So I would encourage you to look at the Open Market Committee transcript that I have down there in item 1 in the description box and kind of poke through the materials. 2, I'll cover them later when the Fed gets back to me. But the Fed's got an issue here one way or the other because it's got to explain how central bank digital currencies are different from Federal Reserve bills. And if your only answer is that the bills don't have a liability associated with them, they're off balance sheet, and there's sort of a suggestion to that effect in the transcript. If your only answer is that the bills don't have a liability, the Fed's got a real problem because there's no liability associated with anything the Fed's issued for the last 50 years. I showed you that in the last video with that law review article. And these memos were written in 2009. You think the staff of the Federal Reserve was thinking about central bank digital currencies back in 2009? Maybe they were, but I kind of doubt it. But it's a big question mark either way. Anyway, that's really it. There's one last thing I want to circle back to, and that's the footnote in paragraph 1 here. Let me just hone in on that. And as I mentioned, that footnote is associated with the Open Market Committee transcript. So I want to talk about that briefly. That footnote is not associated with the date per se. It is really associated with the FOIA Service Center of the Federal Open Market Committee, which fielded my FOIA request. And as I said, that is not the body to whom I submitted my request. I submitted my request not to the Open Market Committee, I submitted my FOIA request to the Board of Governors, and yet it gets passed on to the FOMC because, quote, it is under the purview of the FOMC, and I'm not really sure what that means. But all this discussion of the different bodies, and really, if you back out of this letter and look at the top, the upper right there, the Division of Monetary Affairs, right above the date, April 19th, it all reminded me of Mark Pittman's FOIA case against the Fed back in 2009 or 2010. It was Mark Pittman of Bloomberg and Craig Torres of Bloomberg, and they sued the Fed because the Fed didn't respond to their FOIA request. And it was actually litigated, and they won. Bloomberg and the reporters, Pittman and Torres, won on summary judgment in a decision that was issued by Judge Preska. But Preska's decision is very interesting, and I have it actually in item 6 in the description box. In any event, Judge Preska points out that Bloomberg did not serve a FOIA request on the New York Fed. Now that turned out not to matter because Bloomberg won the case anyway. But as a practitioner, I read that and I'm like, my heart stops for the Bloomberg attorneys. And I'm thinking, oh my God, did they call her malpractice carrier when they read that part of the decision? Because it's like, oh, I didn't do something that I should have done. And it was a reminder to me, I need to, press my own requests as much as I can. And so I submitted my own FOIA request to the New York Fed last Friday. And I got to tell you, I sent that request to the Fed. I did it electronically, the New York Fed, at about 2:08, 2:10 p.m. Eastern Time. And by the close of business, the New York Fed got back to me and said, hey man, your request is deficient. We need X, Y, and Z information, then we'll be able to process it. They didn't have to do that, but then they did. And that was sort of a class thing to do. So, credit where credit's due. I heap a lot of abuse on the Fed, and I heap a lot of abuse on the New York Fed in particular. But like a lot of organizations that, maybe have some dubious leadership, the staff there is on the ball, and they got back to me right away. And so anyway, I went back and touched up my request and fixed it up and sent it on out to the Fed, the New York Fed, a second time. And so now there are 2 pending requests out there to the Fed. One's to the Board of Governors / FOMC. That one's due May 14th. And now there's another one pending to the New York Fed. I don't hold much hope to the New York Fed. That's not a government agency for purposes of the FOIA. I don't think the Fed says on its own website, the New York Fed, we comply with the spirit of the FOIA Act, meaning they don't comply with the letter. So, what's that worth? But we'll see. Anyway, I might try to get another video out on the Fed independence before the 14th. We'll see. Not really sure. Fed independence is just sort of a ludicrous notion that I see more and more, and it's widely misunderstood. I'm going to do what I can to sort of add my 2 cents to that topic. In any case, stay tuned 2 to 3 weeks from now for a video on how the Fed responds to the FOIA request on May 14th. Place your bets on how that's going to turn out in the comment section below. And anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.